Right, you're all good to go. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, can you confirm that I'm audible loud and clear? Cool. Chesta, preferred pronoun she, they. I'll just be again in 10 seconds. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. The cost when it came at development wasn't just the cost of increase in GDP per capita and the fact that these countries were plunged into far more money in their hands than they could probably imagine at the start of the Industrial Revolution. The cost was that they were led into an unsustainable development that caused for later all of these individuals to be susceptible to the harm that is now climate change. 3 things that are going to come from side government in this debate. 1, why is the current scenario of climate change something that requires urgent sort of need and why this is a unique mechanism to solve it? But secondly, how is this model actually going to work out in terms of changing and causing the impacts that we desire on side government? So first things first, let's move on to a bit of characterization. So the current scenario that is climate change, I think nobody in the side is going to argue that that's not an urgent thing to address. But let's talk about how the further extent of growth in the world has harmed that climate change even further, right? Because when it looks like this further growth into investment of like high emission industries, it's also about the kind of ways that you invest in these industries, right? Because they emit high amounts of carbon dioxide, emit high amounts of like greenhouse gases that go ahead and harm the environment. There's a significant increase in the kind of industries that exist, the more and more you try to invest in them. But more importantly, these industries are like quite common in the nature of how they exist. These look like developed countries having established industries in like the forms of oil industries, textile industries that have held an oligopoly that is like extremely damaging to the environment. It is extremely exploitative and damage the environment the most because of the virtue of the fact that they could like consume the similar resources in terms of water, land, and like other things that damage the environment, right? In the way that they consume these resources, they're often in competition with each other, which means the kind of resources that they want to access is extremely scarce as well. But the second most important thing to note here is that these are exactly the companies that invest within the global economy the most as well. So when you see like textile industries, like the big fast fashion industries, like Zara, H&M and all, these are all like set up and based in developed nations, but also cause a large amount of damage to the environment because of the cost at which they're producing and the cost at which they're being consumed, similar to like oil industries like set up in United States of America or set up in like UAE countries or set up in Russia as well. These are all oligopolies that like damage the industry, like damage the environment because of the cost at which they're developing as a whole. The problem with this is because they're so relevant to the development of the economy, because they're so relevant in terms of how they invest in the global economy, because they're so relevant in terms of how they also contribute to other sort of generations of growth. The problem with this is that even when they start to invest in these things, you see that as a good source of investment because that means development for you as a whole. Because they're so like controlling to the global economy, you see that as investing in them means as a direct sort of increase in your global economy as a whole. And because of those reasons, the ability to like sort of control them is limited. So unless and until you're to pursue this idea that you're okay with going ahead and like degrowth of your economy, you're probably not going to go ahead and downsize these companies as a whole, right? So what is the problem? The climate change is that all of these companies have to compete against each other. All of these resources like water, dyes, land, mining, deforestation, using more labor. Note that a large chunk of these industries that are developed and settled in like developed nations also have a large number of these industries and their factories in developing nations as well. This looks like Zara having its factories and Nike having its factories in like Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, all of these kind of things. So the problem is that they're not just like probably increasing the kind of development that exists on them, but they're sourcing these textiles, they're sourcing these resources from these developing countries and reducing the kind of quality of environment that exists in these places. But what is important to note here, right? The kind of environmental damage that they do and the kind of way they exacerbate the climate change within these countries, they're less able to cope with these situations because of the fact that there's lesser sort of resources available to these developing nations to be able to step out of these climate change. This looks like literally causing floods in Bangladesh that people were not able to cope up with because of the kind of ways that these developed countries kind of damaged with their industries that they needed because of the fact that they wanted to pursue higher economic growth. So with all that being said, I think what then is the first argument coming from side affirmative? One, why is there this principle of obligation on these countries to do this right now, and why it's probably important in terms of kind of creating the kind of change that we require in terms of solving climate change problems. Firstly, in the terms of principle of obligation, the kind of development that these countries pursued as they're developed right now happened largely during the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution meant that you were pursuing things without the access of knowledge and information in terms of what kind of damage this was going to cause. The problem with this is they pursued the development that lacked the understanding of like what sustainable resources are, how this development is going to be sustainable. They extremely exploited the kind of resources of fossil fuels that we had, which meant that these resources were depleted at a significant like rate, right? So the problem with this is that the burden then starts to fall on these developed countries for two reasons. One, because they were the ones that caused this. But secondly, note that developing countries are not in that kind of material position with their standards of living, along with their standards of like GDP as well, in terms of how they can go ahead and try to improve themselves and like sort of downsize their economies. But developed countries specifically have that kind of GDP that they require, have that kind of material living standards that they can go ahead and account themselves in terms of trying to downsize their economies and also sort of pursue this degrowth insofar as they can have that availability of resources to still sustain themselves and move into a more sustainable form of development. But it's more important to note that these countries were earlier negligent in the forms that they pursued this development. Towards the later years of their evolution and industrialization, it was well understood that they were causing a lot of climate change, but still it took them more years on end to go ahead and develop the kind of resources that are required to reduce the climate change that is important in terms of moving into sustainable growth of development, right? The problem to do this right now is just to explain in terms of how this will happen, right? The gradual degrowth is something that would largely pursue. So it significantly reduce the GDP investment that happens in the current industries that have high emission rates. This looks like in intense industries that are like increasing the kind of carbon footprint on the world right now. So you try to like tax them. So when you tax them, like the kind of emissions that they have start to reduce for two reasons. One, a large number of companies that exist right now are significantly incentivized by the kind of development they have, right? They're significantly incentivized by the kind of investments that they're getting from the countries that they set up in. Insofar as these countries are going to cost them higher rates of taxes, it's going to sort of reduce the kind of money and the profit that these are able to generate. This pushes them to like diversify into other forms of things, right? This looks like oil companies and oil industry set up in USA and other countries trying to diversify into like probably greener technology and newer ways of things, into terms like forcing oil companies to diversify into renewable energies so that they can continue to establish the certain areas that they get to benefit in these areas, right? This also means that you try to increase the kind of resources that exist to them, but in the way that is going to happen is that you're probably not going to bankrupt these countries, but what you're probably going to pursue is how you go ahead and improve the kind of ways that exist with them, right? So insofar as they're going to be taxed, the more they emit, the problem with this is that you're going to try to push a burden on them in terms of what pursues a way that they reduce these emissions. But what is important to note here is that it doesn't look like probably bankrupting these countries, but it also doesn't look like not being able to use this investment. The current investment of your GDP that you do in terms of pushing these countries to develop further is the same amount of GDP that you'd probably use then to like push these countries into further research and greener technologies and pushing them into probably like diversifying their incomes and all these kind of things, right? But the second thing is also how you reduce consumer spending and how that massively changes the kind of development that happens. Note that people in developed countries also have the most per person capita GDP, which means they also have like high amounts of money that they can use to purchase the kind of things that they want. So the amount of purchasing that comes from like the people in these developed countries is also significantly higher because they have the money to do so. So when they specifically have higher consumer values, like specifically in things of like industries of fast fashion, when you reduce the kind of waste, when you reduce the kind of demand that exists for these things, you also reduce the way that these companies are required to continue their production. With that, couldn't be more proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for what was a very fine speech. Just a quick reminder, after 8:15, the panel will stop writing, so nothing after that point will be credited. We're inviting the first native speaker to begin the round for their bench. Here.
I'm hoping you all can hear me. Hopefully the echo isn't too bad. A university near us very kindly let us use one of their rooms. So
Totally
starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In the 1800s, scholar Thomas Malthus created a model of growth that foresaw a pattern of running out of food and resources, and then a bunch of people died. There is a moral panic and like a scholarly panic over this same phenomenon every 50 years, but continually, humankind has proven that they are able to adapt and prevail without meaning that people suffer. We've lifted billions of people out of poverty over the last century because of these patterns of economic growth. We're going to keep doing it on side negative. 4 things in this speech. Firstly, why is this going to be done poorly? Secondly, why is this just likely to hugely backfire for these economies? Thirdly, how this specifically affects developing economies, particularly ones that are very, very interconnected. And lastly, why this is bad for investment in renewables. But just before I get onto that, responses are integrated, but affirmative examples are nothing exclusive or specific to degrowth in developed nations as well. We think that we can get a lot of their same investment in things like renewable energy, etc. But we think that when people specifically prioritize policies of degrowth, it actually results in a lot of harm for people on the ground. So firstly, why is this likely to be done really, really poorly? Specifically noting that, the topic is about developed nations doing this. So we are going to be the first team to specifically describe what that looks like. A little bit of framing for this point. So obviously it needs to be effective. This degrowth has to work. They can fiat that states will do it, but they can't fiat that it is going to be done well. They can't override the political norms in that nation. So why is this likely to be done poorly? I think the first thing to say is states will often go to the easiest control option, or the one that is likely to see the most amount of results on paper. The first one to say is like laws that they can repeal or pass easily, but very, very importantly, these are going to be people that they see as disposable to their country and their economy. Very, very unfortunately, these are going to be people who are lower income as well. So why are they likely to pursue these individuals? The first thing to say is when they want to curb spending, they are largely likely to target things like welfare. The reason for this being, the richer you are, the more of your income just goes to savings versus poorer individuals who might spend 90% of their month's income on consumer goods as well. The second thing is it is often very easy for these people to roll back welfare. This is easy to do. These are conservative countries. So if they're trying to degrowth their their heating and gas industry, what better way to do this than to make people's welfare budgets so small that they cannot afford to heat their homes? The third thing to say is they are likely to just engage in very lower to middle taxation, because these individuals skew towards purchasing consumer goods. Notice the lipstick index that occurred during the pandemic. People, when they weren't able to do things like go on holidays, did things like buy small consumer goods whenever they could. Literally, that's why I have 5 lip oils in my bag right now. It is literally the kinds of things that people do. They're wanting to curb that spending. So obviously, they can say that this will be done fine in a few instances, but we think that it is easier to control individuals and their spending, particularly if they are politically disenfranchised, than corporations who run a lot of these countries. The second thing to say is just it is not actually that much, that doesn't have that much of an impact on direct emissions for some of the reasons that affirmative identifies, because a lot of these emissions are not coming from these developed nations themselves. So even if on paper it shows that they have a smaller amount of emissions, it is still the manufacturing that they are sanctioning in other areas of the globe is still causing those emissions as well. Over 60% of the world's carbon emissions come from lower income nations, and that is expected to increase because they have large populations that are being lifted out of poverty due to this growth. These nations are also just unlikely to commit as well. Firstly, because they enjoy poverty alleviation, they do not want the majority of their population to be suffering. But the second thing to say is a lot of them have just said no anyway, cite China and Indonesia. Secondly, why we think this is so bad for developing economies. Affirmative spends a lot of time talking about developing economies for a debate that is about divestment, it is about degrowth in developed ones, but a bit of framing on this point. Firstly, obviously these nations are trying to move from primary sort of industries of resource extraction to secondary, tertiary, and quaternary industries. They're trying to take a bump up on the ladder. The thing to say here is investment is required and economic systems are required for these nations. And a lot of that just comes from FDI or people investing in that nation. I would just like to ask a question. Why would any nation or any company want to build a seawall that protects the roads in Bangladesh if they have no goods or no stake in that country? They don't build those seawalls, the farms get salinated, and people can't even go back to subsistence farming. They can't go back to growing food. food. They can't do things like crop rotation because they don't have enough non-salinated land to do that. So that is what happens to these individuals when that FDI is pulled out. Why do we think this harms them? It harms their export industry. They need things like manufacturing. It harms their service industries. If like there's degrowth, why would like a developed nation pay for things like service industries? And then the last thing to say is it harms environmentally good plans. For example, Indonesia is set to become the world's 4th largest economy on a platform of green manufacturing. If they don't have people buying from them and they have no one to buy these products, or they don't have investment into this, they obviously can't do that. It is far more expensive and far less worth it to a nation to then like divest into green energy or resources when you don't have that investment. Far harder. But why is this just likely to cause a huge amount of economic backfiring? We think that this is one of the ways we just win the debate is we prove that this is bad for both developed and developing nations' economy. I think the first thing to say is it leads to a lot of capital flight when these are introduced. Like for instance, even if they were able to make like corporate taxes higher, we think that they would probably just like leave or go to tax havens. And we think that the secondary impact of this is just the second these policies are announced, there's likely to be a huge sell-off from the stock market. Obviously very, very harmful. Secondly, this leads to spooking of that stock market, particularly global-based ones. But note, a lot of individuals, like their retirement plans are held up or tied up in super or investment. The third thing to say is in the event of a recession, we think that this is so harmful. Note, recessions are actually not that easy to predict, particularly with things like increased amount of war or things like pandemics as well. Obviously very, very unpredictable. But the last thing to say is there is likely to be a huge amount of conflict over water over the coming century. Note the increasing amount of conflict around the Grand Renaissance Dam. We think that conflict and tension between nations is actually likely to increase. And obviously, it is not that easy to recover from this. You would rather have growth than degrowth in these instances, because at the point that you receive a shock, at least it doesn't tilt your nation so hard you can't recover from that. It means that your recovery is easier. But what do we think is actually just like a healthier way and a better way to do things like investment in renewables? And the important thing that I would like to note here is that it is like not exclusive to degrowth, because you can still like grow and do industry and manufacturing using things like green energy. That is literally the plan that Indonesia has. But why do we think that a system of growth has actually just been so useful? I think the first thing to note is there's just like been an increase in the amount of renewable energy projects that people want to do because they need to manufacture goods and they want to be able to like use those kinds of things. For instance, like the increase in the amount of solar panels in sub-Saharan Africa, but also like the use of the Three Gorges Dam in China for hydroelectricity. That is an incentive these nations have. The second thing is you are likely to do things like efficient farming production and techniques because you want to be able to grow your nation. You want to be able to have people to eat high quality food. And the last thing to say is you're likely to invest in things like geoengineering, things like cloud seeding, physical barriers that mean that your nation is able to survive and thrive. There's no incentive to have any help to do this, or to have any investment from higher income nations when you don't have a stake in them, or when you're doing a policy of degrowth. When it comes to excessive consumption, we can do things like put laws against like planned obsolescence or encourage a circular economy. Note, this doesn't mean degrowth. People can still purchase goods. It's just some of the materials in those devices or in those products are likely to be recycled. You're way less likely to get FDI in these nations because Western corporations are there for a reason. We think that this growth is really good, but this harms the transition to renewable energy. There is a presumption that you run out of materials. The presumption that economic growth exists is the reason that there is investment, is the reason there is a way to keep going with renewables. So proud to negate.
Thanks, speaker, for what was a very fine speech. Now invite the second affirmative speaker to continue the debate for their bench. Here.
Yep. Am I audible? All right.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Just give me a few seconds. I'll start. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. The most important framing of this debate is that climate change is absolutely real, and what is the best way to solve it? We tell you the best way to solve it is holding developed countries accountable and making sure that they are going through a policy of degrowth where they stop this harm to climate change and probably reverse it. But more importantly, this framing is important because the principle still remains. The fact that these were the countries who necessarily obligated the amount of resources which are there in the world, and they necessarily profited the most out of it, causing harm to the bottom 95% of their own countries, developing countries, and future generations. I think that principle still remains, right? Which is to say that the onus falls on them to make sure that they're trying to reverse their harms. What is the first argument? They say that this is already happening. This means that this is necessarily not exclusive to them and so on. Sure, if this already is happening, we try to accelerate the particular sort of growth, right? Which is to say that we do it even if it costs at the cost of like causing harm to the GDP, because we think there are pertinent harms which we necessarily want to also care about. We talk about that later, right? Which means that their idea about we are doing this anyway necessarily false. But more importantly, their idea about developing countries cause more harms in the first place. Firstly, our principle necessarily takes this down, right? Which means that the developing countries were not part of the first sort of industrial revolution, which means that for extreme quality of life, it is necessary for them to ensure that there's some sort of industrialization which is happening at that point of time. They cannot afford an idea of degrowth, right? Which means that somebody needs to compensate, and we necessarily think it's a developed world. But more importantly, the people who are necessarily left out, these were the developing countries. If they necessarily need things like renewable energy and so on, they do not have money to do this, right? Which means that the developed countries necessarily need to incentivize their own private actors to invest in these kind of technologies as soon as possible, so that developing country can afford things like solar panels at a point at which they can shift towards an economy, right? Which means that the onus again falls on developed countries and their private companies to necessarily do this. I think that is something which is tremendously important. But thirdly, and more importantly, right, developed countries cause most amount of emissions because private countries literally invest in these economies so that they cause the amount of emissions, right? At a point at which you necessarily ban these people for causing these emissions, this directly falls back to these companies and reduces emissions from developing world as well. This looks like manufacturing industries in China, which are companies owned by UNSW or America, which necessarily exploit the amount of Chinese resources and cause the amount of emissions which are causing by China, right? The moment you stop these companies like Nike and Adidas at a point at which they're pursuing things like fast fashion, you necessarily stop that at a point at which you lessen consumer growth, but more importantly, like probably tax them more at a point at which you decrease the amount of invention. But what is the main push coming from them, right? Their first push is essentially about what happens if I want to investment and so on. I want to be very clear here. These companies necessarily don't say that we are going to go bankrupt, right? Which means that they necessarily look to diversify and go away from intensive emission industries to less incentive emission industries. This looks like energy companies looking at their expertise in the energy market itself, necessarily look away from electrical energy and things like fossil fuels and going back to solar energy and so on. What does this mean? This means that these companies necessarily look to diversify, which they're already doing, just as an aggressive rate, because they know that the amount of oil they necessarily want to probably produce would cause a huge amount of taxation, right? Which means that they increase the effort to invest in things like solar energy and so on, because they want to exist in the first time, right? They would not continue to getting exploited by oil, but rather they will look to diversify towards things like renewable energy sources and so on. What does this mean? This means that the FDI and everything else they want to talk about in investment in things like greener technology and so on in countries like Indonesia continues more, and is actually more in our paradigm, because they're forced to invest in these kind of mechanisms because they cannot continue the amount of resource incentive high emission industries in their paradigm, right? Otherwise they will be tremendously highly taxed. I think at that point of paradigm you incentivize growth. But more importantly, let's talk about money, right? Because their main argument is about you necessarily harm the more amount of poorer people because of the fact that the stock market is affected and so on. I want to weigh this out. This money which they necessarily talk about is necessarily which is lost from the upper echelons of like the stock market and the company is not that important in this debate. Multitudes of reasons for this. One, this money is valuable insofar like this helps the most amount of number of people. We would posit this money never trickles down. Why this is likely to be true? This money never trickles down because of the fact that the top 5% necessarily control this amount of money, in which at the point of which they are part of incentive emission kind of industries, right? This affects bottom 95% of the people because of the facts like this affects health at the point of which climate change is affected. The weather is tremendously affected, but more importantly, things like agriculture and everything else is dependent upon weather. All of those climate change harm necessarily hit the bottom for 95%, but more importantly, the money and the growth which they talk about is disproportionate at a point of which it goes to the top 5%, which means that even if we affect that kind of growth, it is something which is not important. But more importantly, right, it harms developing countries more and more because they do not even consent to this, which is to say that the developed world A has already caused the amount of damage, but continues to do so also, which causes things like floods in Bangladesh and Pakistan and so on. Their argument is that you will not make a seawall in the first place. We say that seawalls are something which is not important because their current governments can invest in seawall. The reason why you should be doing and supporting apps in this motion is because you want to avoid the amount of floods which can happen in the future. That can only happen the moment we reduce the amount of emissions raises coming from the developed countries. But lastly and more importantly, even if you do not any of this, you necessarily need to do this even though it helps no one in the present generation, because it helps the future generation, because it decreases the propensity of climate change. There are three reasons why you should be caring about them. First, because they're numerically more, right? At a point at which you necessarily look at the amount of future generation which can exist, there are millions of people who can. At that point of time, you have to care about numerically more amount of people. But secondly, they have lesser amount of agency, right? Which means that the world they are necessarily born in, they necessarily have no agency in controlling the kind of world they are born. At that point of time, you necessarily have to care about what kind of world they're born in. But thirdly, obligation, right? Because of the fact that the past generations have necessarily ensured that you live in a world which is extremely livable, you have to pass on that generation, you have to pass on that obligation to future generations as well. At that point of time, you have to care about future generations, even though you care about nothing else. How do we make climate, like the world better in terms of climate change, right? First thing, I've already talked about this, investment, right? They necessarily assume that these companies lease because like there would be tax havens and so on. Like one, this tax, the motion presumes that this is necessarily happening in developed countries, but what does that mean, right? That means that they have to go to things like developing and underdeveloped countries, right? Countries which are inherently unstable, have lesser policies for things like these companies to settle down because they are foreign companies. They have necessarily measures to support their local industries, right? Which means that they necessarily have poorer policies. But two, if this debate would have been about tax havens, they would have already fucking gone there. I'm extremely unsure why this becomes the tipping point, right? But more importantly, the last push about why they will probably do this poorly is extremely stupid, right? Because A, this motion assumes that we have the fiat to say that these countries necessarily give in terms of tax, like they tax highly, but more importantly, like even if we do not have that fear, notice how dumb it sounds to take welfare spending, which is absolutely not part of the motion. But more importantly, the reason why they can fuck over these kind of people is because these are more often than not the swing voters who necessarily decide which political party to vote, insofar as they necessarily need to see the benefit of this. So this money cannot come from welfare spending. So the thing we necessarily achieve then is diversification towards renewable energies. More investment there to make things like geoengineering and so on. The comparative is that we, at a point of which necessarily say that we will tax your other sort of return management things in terms of extremely higher rates, we necessarily force them to incentivize in things like these kind of geoengineering technologies and solar energies and so on, right? We increase the amount of efforts and we try to accelerate it. For all of those reasons, what we get is a viable solution towards climate change because it's the most compensated harm. We also think that it's okay to not earn that amount of money which this necessarily contribute to the GDP because it doesn't help the most vulnerable. It doesn't help the future generation. That's why we are okay to make that trade-off. Could not be more proud to.
Great. I thank the second affirmative speaker for a very fine speech. Now invite the second negative speaker to continue the round for their bench here.
All right, just making sure I can be heard okay.
Yep, you're all good.
Sorry, were you able to hear that bang upstairs just then?
I don't think so, no.
Okay, because I can deal with it, but if it's in...
Is it dance?
Yeah, funnily enough, I think there's actually a dancing class on upstairs. I could not make this up. But as long as you can hear me, I'm happy to continue speaking with noise, but that's...
So I'll flag if it comes up at some point and becomes problematic.
Yeah, cool. I'm happy to just talk over it, but yeah, let me know if at any point it become inaudible. Dance class above debating competition, could not make this shit up. I want to start this speech by identifying just what a ridiculously long bow this affirmative team have drawn for themselves. They have identified the burden of climate change, something that, yes, requires like drastic reduction in emissions, or drastic actions of geoengineering to engage in carbon capture, to engage in protection of the ice sheets, to engage in stratospheric aerosol injection, and will likely require an enormous combination of many of those things. And then the solution that they've proposed is specific, or I guess have tied themselves to is specifically degrowth of the world's most developed economies. Like, you should be extremely skeptical anytime this team says the word more, unless it is immediately followed by is bad, because they are the side of more is bad. They are the side that has to support the planned contraction of the world's largest economies at a time of great economic instability. They cannot back more investment into renewables, nor incentivize it. They cannot back nor incentivize more of anything. They need to stand behind the burden that the model of economic growth at all, not just within a select few industries that they point to, want to hang their hat on, of more economic growth at all being bad, and specifically within these countries being bad. What we tell you at Aleisha, very, very little plausible response, is that the ongoing growth of the world's most developed nations does not trickle down in a way that trickle-down economists will tell you. But when we say that those benefits arise to even developing economies, we mean that when a country grows and diversifies away from secondary production, that gives your country, secondary level production, that gives your country an ability to engage in secondary level production. That is something that benefits you. Those benefits affect the entire world economy. But importantly, because of the interconnectivity of the entire world export-based market economy, the harms will affect everyone as well, which is again what we tell you at Aleisha. It's a very little plausible response from that speech. First, I'm going to talk about what developed nations can and likely will do when they commit to policies of degrowth, because it is just not true that these guys can say, yes, we only support people like Fashion Nova no longer existing, and fossil fuel like magnates going away from fossil fuels. It's obviously the planned contraction of GDP of these entire countries looks like a few different and probably worse things than that. Secondly, I'm going to explain why it massively backfires, and lastly, I'm going to address their principle of push. And I will know just how many paths to victory our team has this debate. Like, if we prove they do it badly, we win. If we prove that they do it like okay, but it massively backfires, we win. And if we prove that we fulfill a principled obligation to the world's most vulnerable people an alternative way, we win. So let's start with what developed nations can do. They can primarily do two things. That is, they can affect the behavior of their, or to some extent, of their own captive citizens, and they can affect the kind of corporations that they have beholden to them, which I would note is often not all of them. Firstly, let's talk about citizens though. We tell you that yes, the carbon footprint that is associated with people who live in Western nations or developed nations is the highest, not because those countries engage necessarily in the most emissions. In fact, the opposite is often true, but because of the consumption of people in those countries. We tell you that when people try to curb consumption, they're likely to do it in really, really bad ways. They're likely to pull the only lever that they can, which is to tax people who consume the most, which we tell you is by consumption of commodities, which is the thing that they're concerned about countries producing, not actually the top, but in fact the lower to middle, or pull welfare from the lower to middle. Like, that is the lever that they have to pull. That is a very bad lever to pull. But secondly, let's talk about corporations, because they can affect corporations that are beholden to them. We would note that in enormous amounts of instances, they are also beholden to those corporations and are unlikely to do things that completely mess up their mode of productivity. But even if they do or are able to do that, we tell you that those corporations can just leave, like capital flight. We act from these countries we identify as a harm. And if you believe that any of their analysis about why developing nations have absolutely no ability to regulate corporate behavior, more capital flight to set up in those nations where they are beholden to no developed nations norms or laws is obviously also an even bigger harm. Let's secondly talk about a backfiring though, because people who engage in global financial systems operate in extremely risk-averse ways a lot of the time. They also operate in incredibly risky ways. I guess they're just a bit neurotic and edgy like that. But much of global finance, much of domestic finance is smoke and mirrors. It is a game of risk and confidence. And when you are confident in a market, you stay there. When that market poses too much risk, you leave it. And so the second that a major developed country either announces, as this is a planned contraction of their global, of their gross domestic product, announces that they're engaging in a meaningful policy of degrowth, or at all even meaningfully tries to do this, like meaningfully engages in taxation policies that would cut the growth rate of corporations, it will result in a set of truly hellish financial and economic conditions for everybody living in those countries and in the countries that are inextricably connected from them, which to be clear, is a reason that they would engage in it in the way that we tell you at Aleisha, that is not particularly well, to not trigger this kind of capital flight and to not give any of the urgent climate change benefits that this team requires it to. But why is that the case? Firstly, financial institutions watch the actions of governments extremely closely. Is why politicians in theory are not allowed to engage in insider trading, because the stock prices of those corporations are affected massively by the government policies that affect them. We note like the Asian financial crisis was caused by what ostensibly appeared to be minor policy changes and within the IMF that actually caused massive ripple effect harms. And we just tell you that they're likely to engage in things like mass share sell-offs all at once, because people behave with the aggregate information and decision-making of like people who are like ultimately imperfect and risk-averse decision-makers. They see their stock price go down, they see line go down. They think I have to sell to preserve my own stake in this. But secondly, people one level down on that ladder are extremely reactive to the behavior of financial institutions like banks, like investment banks, even consumer banks. They panic. We see this in times of recession. What they effectively have to stand behind, guys, is a planned recession. We see in times of recession, people panic. They panic buy, they hoard, they withdraw all of their money from their accounts, which means that those banks have no money to give out. We see that in rising interest rates. We see that in stagflation that happens in these periods of recession. But thirdly, even if they are able to curb production end, which we know would likely be able to would only be able to be effected within developed countries by curbing consumption, we tell you that they are able, unlikely to be able to curb people's consumptive desires as quickly, like their desire for commodities, their desire to heat their homes, their desire for food. And so that is just likely to lead to a vastly worse quality of life for people living within those countries. But fourthly, they're likely to experience massive amounts of capital flight, which hurts their own economy, and they will just flee to places that refuse to, like we tell you many countries will and do, will refuse to commit to degrowth. But fifthly, they worsen their position massively in the event of any other kind of recession that occurs, because they are already contracting the size of their economy there. So that looks like if a war occurs, or if a major shock to global trade routes occurs, they're likely to have to engage in massive amounts of government spending to effectively reverse the period of financial contraction that they've committed themselves to. All of this to say, the benefits to the environment are at best incredibly diffuse and incredibly speculative and incredibly far off, unlikely to solve climate change or even make as much of a meaningful dent in it as all of the things that we tell you at Aleisha will. But lastly, then let's talk about, and they are likely to hurt many, many people. Like, I don't think these guys realize that when they complain about like clothing companies polluting rivers, they are polluting rivers and also employing people to engage in the production that pollutes those rivers. Those countries go into economic ruin as well, because enormous amounts of their population can no longer work if those companies are not there. Like, what the fuck does this do to Bangladesh? What the fuck does this do to India? What does it do to Indonesia? What does it do to any of these places? It does terrible things to their economy and terrible things to their people. Well, something we tell you is just unacceptable. Thirdly, then let's talk about the principle. Now, I note that much of this principle just goes nowhere in the debate, because environmental obligations are not exclusive to policies of degrowth. We point you to examples and structural reasons at Aleisha why those are not inextricably linked. But secondly, if you accept that there is an obligation to the world's most vulnerable, keeping those people from dying because they cannot access food or clean water or a job or any meaningful quality of life is a far better way to meet that principle burden. And we obviously meet that principle burden much better. So we win.
Thank the second elected speaker for that fine speech. Now invite the third affirmative speaker to close out the substantive contributions for the affirmative bench. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I visible and audible?
Yep, you're all good.
Cool. Give me 2 seconds and I'll start. Hey, starting in 3, 2, 1. Just as when a water body begins to overflow, we have to create a dam to make sure the village does not get flooded. We need to control the economy when its rate of growth is becoming unsustainable. I think the key thing to consider here is that given the wording of the motion, all we need to prove in order to win is that doing this is something that is a justified course of action from the broader perspective of the world, given this isn't specifically an actor motion. Again, it's a should motion, not a would motion. We have to show that this is a principally justified thing to do. But the first thing they tell us is that humankind has been able to prevail in the past and they can keep on doing this. this. Yes, and the way they prevailed in the past was by adapting to existing circumstances. The circumstances now indicate that the quality of life of people is likely to go down because we aren't doing enough to help these people out in the long run. Things like cancer rates are likely to rise. If we don't do something now by adapting a reactionary policy like this to existing circumstances, we never get any change. But I want to be clear. They say the way to do this is to control how and what individuals purchase. Okay, I don't know how degrowth actually doesn't do this at all. Degrowth doesn't mean that you won't have electricity in your homes, but it might look like people in these rich developed countries drive around and travel less, change their diets in ways that are likely to be more environmentally friendly. And this relates to reducing consumer spending. All these outcomes happen because you just sort of just don't push as much money into these things which are more extra or like luxurious in nature. You do that when you don't like waste resources on carbon emissions and stuff like that. But the second thing here is that even if their alternative is effective, there isn't a direct economic opportunity cost here. You can convince people they should spend less and also engage in economic degrowth at the same time. They say we lose the incentive to invest in environmental protection programs in like Bangladesh. I get the idea, but why would this happen? The harms of global warming still occur. We still need to combat it. This is just a step in the way in which we go about combating it, but it's an important first step to be made. Decreasing focus on industries that most directly screw up the economy. That's the only way we can even start creating change in the first place. Second idea we get is like, this is extremely harmful if we already have a recession going on. I think the first thing to note here, there's a distinction between degrowth and a recession. A recession is unplanned, degrowth is planned and strategized. They say we never sure it will be done well. I think the first thing to consider here is this motion is more about whether or not doing this is the right thing to do in the long-term context. But more importantly, the whole point of degrowth is that you end up diversifying your economy more. You end up creating jobs in different areas which don't have high growth rates. So yes, some people might get laid off at the oil production plant, but the way the economy works in general is that new industries pop up and new jobs are created there. We get more stability in the long run because it helps people more effectively deal for the case in which a recession that does occur. And that's why it's good. In negative world, you end up dealing with recessions by the government pushing more and more money into greenhouse gas emitting industries, creating a vicious cycle where the harms of these industries end up compounding and increasing further over time. Three things in the speech. First, in terms of framing, what does the current condition in the world look like for the developing countries? Like what does the pursuit of growth look like in these countries? I think looks like ever since the Industrial Revolution, the main priority of the West and the developed world has been to maximize output. It may have been in order to create some sort of comparative advantage with respect to other in trade, but also has been to create industries which could maximize profit by exploiting other developing countries. Regardless, I think the idea here is that growth, specifically via things like emissions, is slowly going to be not as important as sources of energy that are more renewable. Even if this is not true, it's still a change that has to be made because the direct impacts of industries with large greenhouse gas emissions are extremely visible. That's to say, these industries are trying to create cooler things via, say, like fast fashion, but if they keep doing this, there isn't actually going to be a future in the first place. The only way to change this is by deprioritizing the amount of money that we put into these industries. If doing this is going to create more and more sustainable economic conditions, we think that's a good outcome in and of itself. But I want to be clear that the global situation now is highly different compared to what it was like a few hundred years ago or like 50 years ago, right? There wasn't awareness regarding issues like climate change and global warming, and economic development was the sole priority, which is why having relentless economic growth was justified, because people didn't know they were making the long-term trade-offs at that point of time. Right now, we know these trade-offs exist. We see their impacts in our day-to-day lives with much more unpredictability in weather patterns, things like the rate at which natural disasters occur drastically increasing. So here's the opportunity cost weighing. Capital in these countries is something that's finite, yes, but lots of monies in these countries is currently invested in these unsustainable corporations because they employ a lot of people and politicians want votes from people. So they're fine with making these environmental trade-offs because it's what helps them keep in power. We say we need to make this change now because before the harms of climate change become so vast that they're effectively irreversible, a point of time that humanity is very soon approaching. So instead of investing this portion of the GDP in these unsustainable countries, like maybe spend a bit less, fine, but like invest it in social security programs which don't boost the GDP, but improve quality of life for people who need this thing the most, the ones who end up suffering from climate change the most. Invest this money into creating other alternative sources that will be able to benefit these people. I think the key difference here is between developing and developed countries is this: developing countries don't have the resources, while the developed countries waste resources on unnecessary luxuries. All these benefits that have come to developed countries have come at the expense of developing nations. So that the comparative is important. It's much more difficult for developing countries to degrowth. Unemployment and exploitation is much worse in these countries. Creating some sort of economic growth in these countries is the objective priority because the needs of the country at the moment are too high, which means it's unfair to push the burden of complete environmental protection on these nations specifically. We think as the developed nations, if we are the ones who have started this harm, we also have the obligation to be the first to stop its growth in the first place. So what's weighing of all of this? First things in terms of sustainability and the fight to consider like how climate change is going on right now. They say this is like a method to directly cause corporations to make change, right? They say now corporations will have no incentive to develop things in developing countries because now they don't have a stake there. I think firstly, even if this is true, this is fine considering the worst harms to these countries are literally as a result of these exploitative industries existing, because the harms under this particular context are not just environmental in nature, but when they talk about employing people in like Bangladesh and India, it's also in terms of things like human rights violations. But secondarily, this doesn't deal with the analysis you get in first and second half, that when you do this, you directly make corporations want to diversify away from a development of industries specific to these emissions to a broader group of industries because you want to protect your interests. Degrowth is focused on shrinking your one big area of operation right now, and you inherently have the incentive to sort of diversify and go into newer industries, go into sustainable fuel, because it's clear that there isn't going to be any restrictions on growth in that. So yes, the entire world is connected and harms will apply to developing nations as a result of this. But I want to be clear, when we fight climate change, there are economic trade-offs that are going to have to be made. The comparative is this. In our world, the impacts to these countries in our worst case are secondary in nature, i.e. they're highly the probability is firstly less because they're dependent on like the impacts to a different country. But in their world, they're going to have to make direct changes to developing countries' economies, which are already unsustainable, and we have to prioritize making sure those countries are protected right now. But they say like this is a preemptive measure in case of large economic collapse, right? I think the first thing to consider here is the way in which the growth rate is operating. There's a huge compounding effect. A growth rate of 2% per annum might seem small, but it becomes more visceral over time as it compounds in scale. But when stock markets fluctuate, they fluctuate when the government decides to do anything ever. Countries still implement policies that affect industries. Why? Because they say that doing this will increase the net quality of life of individuals. We show you this is going to be good for the quality of life. The main contention from them here is that the implementation is bad, market confidence will be lost. I think slowly decreasing public faith in the oil and gas market is a good thing because that industry is a bubble with limited resources anyway. Their idea is that people will panic. Op never shows the likelihood of people reacting this way because no, this is not a recession. It's a move that's being made by the nation. It's a strategic thing that they're doing. They can market it this way. This is something that we have to do. It isn't going to screw over your lives. It's a planned solution to implement that so we can make sure our lives are better in the long run. But let's talk about how this impacts sustainability in ops world, right? They give no method for how this is ever going to be maintained. They don't explain likelihood of this being done in any way in their world. If you keep investing so much in these industries, sure, they might employ lots of people right now, but they'll keep on employing people. They'll keep on employing more and more people. And this means the harms that still exist, this harm still exists to a great scale. But the last thing to talk about then is just the principle here, right? I think the key contention is one of moral obligation. From a broader perspective, it's justified doing something like this is justified because of the goals that we're trying to accomplish. Because the goal is protection of future generations. We give you reasons in second half for why this is important and how this is the right thing to do itself. They have no response to our principle in this debate other than to say that there are other ways we can do this. I mean, sure, you can do this in other ways too. That doesn't mean you have to deprioritize this. You can still focus on degrowth. You can make sure these industries shrink while at the same time implementing other measures. That's completely fine on our world. We just think degrowth is the first starting step. For these reasons, vote Gov.
I thank the third affirmative speaker for that fine speech. And now to close out the substantive contribution for the negative bench, I invite the third negative speaker. Here.
Well, if their entire case and contingent principle is about fixing climate change, they better be sure they actually do get positive change and don't make it even worse. We have said they will make climate change worse, and I'm going to explore that through 4 questions in this speech. The first is that this policy simply will not work, it will backfire. Secondly, even if it works, it will be done in a way that is bad and not the good way the affirmative team wants. Thirdly, even if it is done well and works, it will be bad for climate change still because it harms developing countries. And then fourthly, even if it gets some benefit for fixing climate change, you have to weigh that against the harms to human development that we have pointed out in our speeches. And we say those things are logically precedent and simply more important. Let's go through those 4 questions. Firstly, why this policy will not work. Our logic here is simple, and they consistently misunderstand it. We are not saying that the government is not implementing a controlled policy. Obviously, by virtue of the topic, this is the government implementing a controlled policy. What we are saying is the government cannot control external factors outside that policy. Therefore, this policy can only ever be short-term because it is a contractionary economic policy literally designed to put the country into recession by shrinking its economy. And if there is another crisis that happens, whether that be, as we explained, a war, a disease, a supply shortage, a shortage of capital, bad decisions made by the IMF in some country, or a stock market crisis in a particular country. Due to the global contagion, that crisis will then reach your country. As we have seen empirically, every 10 or 5 years, there is a global economic crisis, and your country will be screwed because you are already shrinking it, and this policy threatens to shrink it even more. So imagine the GDP and other financial crises times 10, because you are literally bringing that crisis upon yourself, and then an external factor makes it far worse. And so they can control the government implementing their policy, but as we have explained, they cannot control the external circumstances that threaten an economic collapse that we have seen through many different factors happen every few years. And consider, even if you think the government can do this well, just how bad governments have had economic policy implemented in the past, like how they have, created stagflation or done that, like not regulated their economy or printed too much money, like as if governments are the most trustworthy actor here. But even if they weren't, it is external circumstances that you can't control. They say, I guess, well, you need change to fix this thing now. So even if there is, I'll take them generously and take this as an implied response to our material, given they never directly respond to it. They say, well, even if there is some risk of collapse, we need to change and fix now. Two things. Firstly, we have provided counter fiat in that we can invest in renewables and regulate against things like planned obsolescence that create consumption that is bad. So we can still invest in renewables and still get structural change. We have quite a bit of counter fiat in this debate. But even if that doesn't work, this issue proves how climate change would get worse, or at best they would only claim the benefit for a few years, because they only get to implement this degrowth policy for a few years until there is inevitably a crisis. And at that point, your economy has to revert back to all the bad things you were already doing, because it has no other way to make money. Like, you do not have the money to invest in renewables. You do not have the money to limit consumption, or to ensure that greenhouse gases are not emitted, or to tax your companies by putting on carbon taxes because your economy is in the shitter. That is the harm here. It goes back to what it was before. So at best, their policy only works for a few years, and at worst, it reverts back to something that was way worse. But secondly, even if this policy does work, in this issue, I'll ask the question of why it is not in the affirmative team's good way. Because we say the cuts will go against the most vulnerable, because the poorest people in society have the most marginal propensity to consume, and therefore, if you want to limit consumption, you want to cut the welfare money they get to consume, and you would also want to impose high taxes on low to middle income earners, because those are the people who consume the most in society, whereas the rich people have a greater capacity to save. And that means you are harming the most vulnerable people in your country in a way that is not good for the economy and is harmful to those people who live in poverty. They say we have fiat, we will tax all people highly, but yeah, it is like, it's not who you tax. You don't have fiat to assume that. The objectives in this debate are twofold under your side: to tax highly and to decrease consumption. And we have identified that the best way to do both things is to tax and the most vulnerable. They say, oh, well, these people are swing voters and therefore they won't suffer. But yes, but firstly, the rich are also the people who donate to elections. So obviously the rich would just be like, can you please, once you get elected, pass a policy that makes them taxed and not us taxed? But secondly, you can just easily spin the narrative that we're going through a period of degrowth, therefore there will be some austerity measures, therefore, unfortunately, you will have to suffer to a significant extent, and therefore you will be the ones that have to be taxed the most. And unfortunately, poor people will kind of have to live with the consequences of that due to their little political capital. They say, oh, we can just implement measures straight up, like a carbon tax, for example. But carbon taxes would also just be passed on to consumers. It is profitable for companies to just pass on the price of them paying that carbon tax to the people who then have to pay for their energy, because that means they can keep polluting and keep making as much money as they want. And they have the political capital in all developed countries through corporate capture to lobby those governments to ensure that is what happens. And there is no regulation against them passing on that price. And they say, well, now companies will actually have to divest into more renewable energy. But that is exactly what they kill, because on their side, there is no money for investment. These companies no longer have the resources to spend and invest into new things because they are shrinking. They are also going through a period of degrowth. So we flip this. You kill the capacity for these countries to invest in green energy, and you pass on the price of carbon taxes to the consumers in those countries. So therefore, at the end of this second issue, if this is done in a bad way, it mitigates the impacts of their points enormously, because they no longer get good green behavior. They just, in fact, punish the worst parts, the most vulnerable people in that economy, and therefore we flipped their argument. Thirdly, then, will this harm developing countries? And we say that they have secondary and tertiary industries that are contingent on foreign direct investment from Western countries, that second affirmative just concedes will now go away. Like there will no longer be investment. That is crippling. They say, oh, well, developing countries must adapt to new circumstances. They were. China was investing in hydroelectricity. Indonesia had geoengineering. There were carbon capture technology being developed. You've ripped the rug out from underneath them. They now can no longer develop those things, because then they're like, oh, well, if they don't have foreign direct investment, surely these countries will still care about the environment and they will still care about investing in green technology. But firstly, they have far less capacity to do so, these developing countries, because they're often in debt, and now they do not have foreign direct investment into their industries that allows them to even invest in green technology in the first place. But secondly, you have made developing countries desperate because they need to pick between their environmental obligations and ensuring human development for the huge amount of people in these countries that are in an enormous amount of poverty. Obviously, they will pick helping those people in poverty, which means they can no longer get the added benefit of green investment and technology. You have actually killed their capacity. They say, well, the very employment of people in developing countries is in fact a harm under our side because it could be inhumane. But firstly, often it is not like setting up sweatshops, it is just investing in those countries, which allows them to grow their own industries. But secondly, despite those harms, these manufacturing industries have lifted millions of people out of poverty in recent years and been profitable for the global supply chain. Even if the manufacturing in these countries is not perfect, it is still good. So therefore, they harm developing countries and reduce their capacity to reduce emissions. But fourthly, I would just like to say our impacts are more important, because even if you believe that they get some change for climate change, and then we get a harm to people in developing and developed countries, our harm is logically and chronologically precedent, because if people are poorer in developing countries, they will cut down forests to keep warm. You know, they will not build filters on the top of their factories to ensure that pollution does not happen. They will access the most available source of energy there is, which is fossil fuels, and therefore they have the harms of pollution on their side in developing countries still exist, with the added human suffering that we describe of these people not being able to just live and develop and get out of poverty. For those reasons, this is such a comprehensive negative victory. I'll hand you over to Connor, by the way. Connor will come over.
Yeah, thanks, Speaker, for that fine speech. And now I invite the opposition reply speaker to close out the negative bench. Here.
All right, just making sure I can be heard.
Yes, you're good.
I think it is in fact the third affirmative who puts this team's folly the most eloquently and the most succinctly, which is that they assume that, well, this is kind of like a morality debate. It is kind of like a question of whether this is the thing that these countries should do. And that is what they hide behind to avoid doing the work that was required of them in this debate, to not assume, but to prove. Because they could assume that developed countries would, like under their world, pursue policies of degrowth, but they had to prove the following. They had to prove how they would specifically do it. They had to prove that the people that they would target and the policies that they would target would people targeted would react in the way that they say they will. And they had to prove that the way that people reacted and people responded would actually work to solve the problem that they themselves identify and the imperative that they think is going to carry them to victory, but is in fact not, because I will prove on all three of those grounds, as we have proved down the bench, that they fail on each of those counts. Let's firstly talk about how they would do it. We tell you that countries will react and will do these degrowth policies in a way where they have the capacity and also the incentive. That is to say, where they have levers to pull, they have things that they can do as those governments, as those countries, what they can control, and where they have the incentive to actually want to do it. Or honestly, I think even just the absence of a massive disincentive. Unfortunately for this team, we tell you that firstly, the capacity and the levers that governments have and those states have access to are often to do things like levy taxes, are often things like cut their own spending, and we tell you secondly, that the incentives for those governments, which are backed by corporations, which rely on the presence of those corporations in those countries for their re-election, for any semblance of GDP that they will have after this, for their funding. And so therefore, the levers that they are likely to pull is they are not likely to immediately tax those corporations like this is such that they can no longer remain in that country. They're likely to tax middle and income earners. They're likely to pull those people's welfare, likely to make their lives more expensive in other ways so that they stop consuming. We see this empirically with much of the discourse with response to inflation. Like those are the measures that are on the table. That would also be the measures that are on the table if you want to curb the consumption portion of gross domestic product. Because as we tell you, a lot of the production end of gross domestic product that contributes to climate change is in fact done abroad. Like it's just done in developing countries as they themselves concede. So secondly, let's talk about reaction. These companies that they claim will react in the way that they will, that is divest away from bad things and into good things, one, just can't, right? Because they can't make a profit. They can't make as much of a profit on those renewable energies because they are also in a period of degrowth, as we identified down the bench, and then again at Bennett. They cannot do those things, but also they just will not do those things. If you tax them enough to disincentivize them from turning that profit at all, they are likely to engage in forms of capital flight and corporation flight. They're likely to go to countries where those regulations and that capacity to regulate those behaviors of those corporations are much worse, and in fact contribute to a worse problem. And we just identified that under the status quo, they had a series of reasons to continue to react in this way. There was an expectation that growth would continue, an expectation that they were going to be able to make a profit and continue to engage in things like the stock market and not engage in mass sell-off and in mass panic. And they were going to be able to turn a profit on renewables, and that is why they pursued them, because there was a finite supply of fossil fuels, finite supply of profit. That's why we saw so many green energy products, so much divestment away from fossil fuels. But lastly, in this reply and in this debate, that they needed to prove that the way that people would react to these things would work. And we just have comprehensively proven that the way that people react to these things, whether that is a financial institution, a stockbroker, an individual withdrawing all of their money from a bank, the way that they panic when periods of recession are on the horizon. And this is just a form of recession. It doesn't matter if it's planned, if it's unplanned. People's reaction, their fear, the investor flight is often the same. Will not help climate change. In fact, it will actively make it worse. And that is why we win.
Thanks, Speaker, for that very fine speech. And now to round out the round, I invite on the affirmative reply speaker here.
Yep. Am I audible?
Your voice was
Yeah,
breaking a little while ago. Just make sure you're fine later.
Yeah, it is kind of choppy.
Is it better now?
Yes.
Yeah, just give me a few seconds. I actually dropped out of the call.
Everything?
Yep. All right. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. The first observation about this team is that how uncharitable they are. They say that governments will do it in the worst way possible because companies are huge, right? And they necessarily would not do it in the worst, they would not do this in a proper way, but they'll probably steal money from people from welfare states. One, like supremely uncharitable, but two, you would not be able to justify this policy because these are the people who are supposed to vote, right? Third next response that, hey, but rich people can still say you to not do this doesn't really stand because rich people are numerically small. These people who are dependent upon welfare are numerically high. This means that you would not do this at a point at which these people are dying because they don't have heat. I think that is tremendously uncharitable in the first place. But their premise itself is faulty, regardless of the impacts and the mechanisms they have for it. The premise is these companies shrink. First half tells you two things. One, these companies wants to stay in the country because of the benefits they get from these countries. But the second thing this first half tells you is that they will diversify. The fact that they're already doing this means that they will accelerate their efforts towards this. What does this mean? That means that in the worst case, even if they lose money, that's okay, because these are trillion-dollar industries. We think that a few billion getting lost is absolutely fine. But more importantly, the reason why this is important, because guess what? No company ever wants to get bankrupt. And that is crucial in this debate. If that is the case, and also the fact that these are extremely competitive industries, it means that they will diversify more and more to make sure that they're not paying high taxes. But third neg tells me that, you know what, they will make sure this they're like getting back this tax via charging more. One, that's bad for them, because this means that the demand extremely decreases for them, which means that they will not be able to make money anyway. So the fair assumption is that they will diversify. I want to check your sheets if there is any sort of response to this mechanization. They never give you one. And regardless of the fact that we have an ESL action, doesn't really mean that they ignore this mechanization and keep on seeing they're shrinking. But let's assume these companies shrink. We think that's an okay thing to do because of few reasons. One, if these companies are the ones who are causing high amount of emissions, we want them to get rid of them in the first place. Because notice the most impactful argument in this debate and the most important harm in this debate is about climate change. Notice they don't have any counterfactual rather than saying that developing countries don't get money to fight their own climate change efforts. One, we tell you more often than not, the harms which developing countries get because of climate change is because of these companies who invest and make manufacturing plants here. But more importantly, they also never prove to you that these companies which are highly intensive in emissions are the companies who are investing in things like Indonesia's green energy. I think that is some sort of tension between both of those arguments. They never prove to you why that's likely to be true. We tell you it's highly likely to be true in our paradigm because you are forced to diversify in our paradigm. Otherwise, you lose out on money. At the point of which you lose money, you will necessarily invest in those kind of things. But even if you do not buy any of those things, we necessarily think it's okay if some people are laid off, right? Because we think it's short term. Because if this market is something which is recessionary, we tell you this is not true because the market just shifts, right? We just say oil companies lose money which have high emissions, but oil companies which announce that they will necessarily make sure they have efforts in things like solar energy and so on, necessarily now earn money because now people know that governments is trying to invest in this. I think the market shifts there. But more importantly, even if you do not buy any of these things, three things which you must buy. One, the bottom 95% who is affected by health, agriculture, and weather, who necessarily do not have any say in this because these companies work on oligopolistic ways. Two, developing countries which have no consent to the harms caused by these companies, things like floods in Pakistan, extreme heat in Egypt. But lastly, the future generations who have no agency in the world, they will likely to be born in the future. Those three things necessarily outweigh everything they have said. Could not be more proud to propose.
Fantastic. I thank the government reply speaker or the affirmative reply speaker for that fine speech and all speakers for a fantastic round. And I once again want to congratulate all of you for reaching the pre-quarterfinals of Campbelltown Australs. Give yourselves a nice round of applause.